A cool June morning in 2018 began with an unusual disturbance on Lakeside Avenue, North Seattle. 6 unmarked police cars quietly pulled up in front of a one-story wooden house overlooking Lake Washington. Neighbors slightly pulled back their curtains, watching as officers in bulletproof vests positioned themselves around the area. Inside, David Pearson, 73 years old, was preparing his morning coffee, a habit he had maintained for 20 years since retiring from Boeing. A rapid knocking sounded at 7:21 a.m. David Pearson, Seattle Police. We have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the disappearance of Natalie Pearson in 1979. The officers later recounted that the old man's hand trembled slightly as he set down his coffee cup, but his face remained unusually calm, as if he had known that sooner or later the past would come back to find him. Before diving deeper into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. Seattle in 1979 was a city of endless rainy days. Each drop fell evenly on tin roofs, soaking into the mottled asphalt, making every sound of the city seem blurred. In the south, smoke from Boeing factories blended into the fog, while in the north, the residential area along Lake Washington was quiet under the pale yellow light of old-fashioned street lamps. The city wasn't crowded yet, but it already showed the first signs of transformation, young engineers discussing computers in coffee shops, while Boeing workers still left their shifts with oil-stained clothes. In that setting, Natalie Pearson, 29 years old, stood out like the image of a modern woman of the era, independent, dedicated, and orderly. She ran the Rainlight Haven Elderly Care Facility in North Seattle, where there were 6 staff members and more than 24 elderly residents. Natalie's work started at dawn and often only ended after dark, when she checked the medication logs, locked each room's door, and then headed home. Her staff were accustomed to the petite figure in a gray wool coat, walking quickly and speaking little, but always inquiring about patients in a voice as gentle as Seattle's rainy wind. Natalie lived with her husband David Pearson, a mechanical engineer working for Boeing, in a 2-story light blue house right on the edge of Lake Washington. The house was built in the early 60s, with a wooden porch, a gravel path, and a small garden with neatly planted pine trees. Neighbors described them as a quiet couple, living neatly, rarely arguing. People only knew that Natalie often drove to work early and returned late, while David sometimes came home first to prepare dinner. They had no children, only an orange cat named Willow, which often sat guarding the window whenever it rained. On March 1st of that year, the morning began with low clouds and cold winds blowing in from the lake. Natalie arrived at Rainlight Haven as usual, working until late afternoon. Before leaving, she told a staff member that she would stop at the grocery store on the way home to buy some things for the weekend. She carried her purse, car keys, and left the parking lot in the faint light of late afternoon. That was the last time anyone saw Natalie Pearson. That evening, David returned home after dark. The kitchen was silent, the wall clock showed 8 o'clock. No sign that Natalie had come back. He turned on the porch light, reheated coffee, sat waiting. Time passed slowly, rain tapping on the window glass. By midnight, when the neighbors' lights had gone out, he began to feel uneasy. Dialing the phone, call after call to Rainlight Haven, to Natalie's friends, then to the nearest hospital, all replied that no one knew where she was. Outside, the cold wind blew stronger, tilting the rain toward the lake. Near dawn, when all leads were silent, David stood up, picked up the landline phone, contacted the Seattle Police Department's on-duty desk. He spoke briefly, voice tired and halting. His wife had disappeared, and he couldn't find any trace of her anywhere in this city. At the command center on Dexter Avenue, the night shift had been quiet until that call was logged near dawn. The duty officer heard a hoarse male voice, noted briefly adult missing person report, unusual factors, then opened a new file, numbered missing person 04779. 2 patrol officers from the Lakeview area were dispatched to the scene. When they arrived, the neighborhood was still shrouded in thick fog, yellow lights reflecting on the wet road. House number 4184 stood silent, Door locked, porch light still on, no signs of forced entry. David Pearson opened the door, face haggard from lack of sleep. He led them through each room, saying nothing had been touched since the previous evening. Inside, everything was neat, bed sheets smooth, Natalie's closet intact on the dressing table, a watch, wedding ring, and a small notebook. On the dining table were an old coffee cup and the previous afternoon's newspaper. No suitcase or bag was missing, except the purse she took to work. One officer noted, no signs of prepared departure. They asked a few more questions. When was the last time he saw his wife? Any arguments or recent changes? David replied that the previous evening she left the facility, planned to stop at the store for groceries, and hadn't returned. He spoke softly, as if trying to reassure himself that maybe she was stuck somewhere due to a car breakdown or heavy rain. After completing the initial check, police initiated the preliminary search procedure. A summary report was sent to the center. Female, 29 years old, missing over 12 hours. No signs of voluntary departure, important personal items still at home. Per procedure, they contacted 3 major hospitals in the area: Harborview, Swedish, and Providence, but no matching admission records. Traffic control was asked to check for collisions or abandoned vehicles within 24 hours, results negative. Next, police called gas stations and convenience stores along the route from Rainlight Haven to the Pearson home, asking about a woman driving a silver Plymouth. No staff remembered anyone matching the description. At the same time, the administrative department issued an internal bulletin within the Seattle PD system for the missing person case, coded 04779. Including Natalie's photo provided from her driver's license, long brown hair, about 5 feet 6 tall, petite build, often wearing a light-colored coat. The bulletin was sent to nearby stations in Kirkland and Bellevue for coordinated sweeps. In the end-of-shift report, the supervisor noted that no basis to indicate victim left voluntarily and recommended maintaining alert status for the next 24 hours. As the patrol team left, the sky had fully brightened, rain still falling steadily. David stood on the porch, hands in his coat pockets, watching the police car leave the empty street. Inside the house, familiar objects remained still in their places. No signs of violence, no note left behind. Everything evoked the feeling that Natalie had just stepped out for a brief moment and should have returned. But she did not return. That morning, the file in her name was officially transferred from missing unknown cause to the active watch list of the Seattle Police Department's Criminal Investigation Division. The next day, when the internal bulletin about the disappearance was issued, a patrol team from the Kirkland area was assigned to sweep the road along Lake Washington, where Natalie might have passed before vanishing. It was still lightly raining, fog thick over the lake surface and obscuring the row of trees along the road. Around 9 in the morning, an officer spotted a car parked askew beside a path leading down to the water's edge. It was a silver Plymouth, license plate matching the vehicle registered to Natalie Pearson. The car sat still as if it had been there all night, front wheels caked in mud, windows fogged with condensation, no skid marks or signs it had been dragged. The patrol team stopped, cordoned off the area with yellow tape, then called the Center for Crime Scene Technical Support. As they approached, they saw the car doors were locked, handles dry, no pry marks or scratches. Inside, the windshield was covered in a thin layer of fog, making everything inside hazy. An officer shone a flashlight through the window. Grocery bags still intact on the passenger seat. Inside a package of coffee, a carton of milk, a few unopened receipts. On the back seat was Natalie's coat, folded neatly, collar still with a few long brown hairs attached. Her wallet was in the center console. Inside still her ID, driver's license, some loose change, and bank card. Everything was kept in place, no signs of rummaging. After receiving the information, the Seattle investigation team immediately arrived on the scene. They took photographs, measured the distance between the car and the water's edge, recorded the tire positions and parking direction. The surrounding traces showed the car was parked straight, with no signs of collision or emergency. The ground was muddy, only showing fresh police boot prints. A technician bent down to check the car door, discovering the lock was intact, no key in the ignition. When the door was opened with specialized tools, a musty smell mixed with a hint of coffee from the grocery bag nearby wafted out. Everything inside the car seemed frozen in an ordinary moment. The passenger had left quietly, without haste, without signs of panic. In the trunk, police found a small blanket, a first aid kit, and a few personal items. Things typically kept in Natalie's car: no bloodstains, no broken glass shards, no foreign objects. The officers seized the grocery bags, wallet, and coat, sealing them in nylon bags to send to the lab. One of them noted in the report, "No clear signs of crime, unusual parking location, need to determine when the car was abandoned." This trail area was little traveled, with only a few fishermen and an old maintenance station about 200 meters away. They were preliminarily interviewed, but no one remembered seeing the car the previous evening. The wet weather and slippery road made tracing evidence around the car difficult. A technician used powder to detect footprints, but only found a few mixed in the mud, not enough to identify. By noon, as the rain began falling heavier, police decided to tow the car to the city's impound lot for further examination. They clearly recorded the recovery time, location, witness names, and took overall photos before moving it. As the car was loaded onto the tow truck, McKinley, the lead investigator, was present to supervise the process. He ordered all doors, wheels, and hood sealed to prevent any access before inspection. In the report sent back to Seattle PD, he noted, "Victim's vehicle found in remote location, no reasonable reason to stop here. No evidence of flight or voluntary departure. Need to consider criminal factors." That afternoon, when the Plymouth was brought to the inspection yard, the technical team conducted an initial exterior assessment: no scratches, no impacts, normal tire condition, engine intact. Signs indicated the car was actively shut off and locked from outside. The rear window was dry, proving no one had opened it overnight. All information was entered into file 047-ND79, along with the crime scene map. Seattle police officially classified the Natalie Pearson case as a missing person with criminal elements and transferred the file to the Criminal Investigation Division for handling. From here, the young woman's disappearance was no longer a routine leaving home case, but became a mystery-laden suspected crime in the heart of the rainy Lakeside city. The discovery of the silver Plymouth marked the first turning point in the case. The file was handed over to the Seattle PD's Major Crimes Unit, and the primary responsibility fell to Detective John McKinley, 42 years old, a seasoned investigator in missing persons and domestic violence cases. McKinley was known in the unit for his caution, reticence, and always valuing details over intuition. He began by reviewing all information collected from the first night, David Pearson's statement, the scene report at the Lakeside house, and the car examination results. His first step in the process was reconstructing Natalie's movements on her final afternoon. McKinley went to Rainlight Haven, speaking with 2 evening shift staff members. They said Natalie left the office around early evening. After checking the medication logs and kitchen, she carried her purse, wore a gray coat, and said she would stop at the small grocery store at the intersection between Kirkland and 85th Street. The receipt found in the grocery bag on the car matched this store, printed with a checkout time around early evening. The distance from there to home was just over 10 minutes drive, but the car was discovered the next morning in a completely different location off the route, nearly 2 miles away and right by the lake. McKinley noted in the report, unexplained time gap of over 1 hour, need to verify victim's actual route. Returning to the Pearson residence neighborhood, McKinley and a technical officer walked around the block, asking each house what they saw on the night of the disappearance. An elderly couple in the house across the street remembered that late in the evening, they saw the lights in the Pearson house turn on and then off, completely after just a few minutes. The wife said she heard a car engine start, but wasn't sure of the direction. Other households saw nothing unusual, because of the rain and the area's typical quietness. McKinley marked the information on the map, confirming that at that time, Natalie should have been home if she had taken her normal route. When returning to question David Pearson further, McKinley noticed the man's calm was unlike the reaction of someone who had just lost contact with his wife. David was cooperative, but did not proactively suggest searches or ask about investigation progress. When asked for details about his own schedule, he only said that evening he was home alone, prepared a meal, then went to sleep, with no one to corroborate. McKinley requested to see his workroom, where there was a drafting table and a few designs. No unusual signs, but the investigator felt the excessive neatness made the room seem recently rearranged. The initial report was compiled the same day. McKinley concluded that the victim showed no signs of voluntarily leaving home. The vehicle was abandoned in an illogical location, and the husband's statement lacked verifiable basis. He submitted a request to superiors for permission to place David Pearson under temporary surveillance for 48 hours. Police would monitor movements, contacts, and any unusual activities to prevent the possibility of this person intending to leave the city. That same afternoon, McKinley returned to the lakeside scene for another personal observation. The sky was still thick with fog, the water surface calm, and the trail soaked. He stood for quite a while at the spot where the car had been parked, cross-referencing the map and taking notes. In his notebook he wrote, "Car parked carefully, without haste, likely by someone familiar with the area. No evidence of collision or skidding. Vehicle facing north, opposite the direction home." The last line on the page was brief. "Need to determine reason for leaving the main route." Back at the office, McKinley reviewed all the crime scene photos and the initial night's reports. He paused at the photo of the half-finished coffee cup on the dining table, then at the spare key set neatly beside the newspaper. Those small details, in his experience, did not belong to someone leaving intentionally. In the end-of-day report, McKinley wrote a concise comment, "Cannot rule out criminal activity. Need to expand investigation." The next morning, after McKinley's request was approved, the Seattle Police Department's forensic team was dispatched to the Lakeside, Washington home for a detailed examination. The weather remained cold and damp, fog covering the lake surface, moisture seeping into every plank of the fence. The backyard was spacious, with a few wilted flower beds and a low row of pine trees. From the outside, the house showed nothing unusual: tidy yard, freshly mowed grass, windows closed tight, but as the forensic team began their inspection, they quickly discovered an anomaly. Near the rear fence corner, a small pile of ash about the size of a paint can. The ash was gathered in a circle, mixed with many metal fragments and dark streaks still clinging to the soil. One technician bent down, detecting a faint gasoline smell rising from the damp ground. He used a metal spoon to collect a sample, placed it in a glass vial, and labeled it ash sample, rear yard, southeast position. In the on-site report, the technician noted signs of burning synthetic materials, unusually high temperature, likely use of accelerant. McKinley was present at the scene when the forensic team moved to the garage area. The sliding door was opened, a faint smell of gasoline and old paint in the air. On the cement floor, near the corner where the toolbox was kept, a long stain about half a meter long was clearly visible under flashlight. Its dark brown color stood out against the surrounding gray. When the technician applied a cotton swab with Kastle-Meyer rapid test solution, the swab tip turned pale pink, positive reaction for hemoglobin, indicating human blood. McKinley jotted a brief note in his notebook and ordered the area sealed, allowing no one to enter until photos were taken and samples collected. The evidence was carefully gathered: soil around the ash pile, ash and metal fragments, a few hairs stuck in the cement grooves, along with solution from the garage stain. One technician checked near the back door, discovering a small oil slick leading to the yard, possibly gasoline spilled during ignition. All samples were documented and added to the evidence list. In the scene summary, the lead technician wrote, Evidence of object burning in rear yard, stained suspected human blood in garage. Residual gasoline odor in both areas, recommend additional chemical analysis. While the forensic team worked, McKinley walked around the house, observing the arrangement of items. Everything was excessively neat, as if recently cleaned. The kitchen trash can was empty, containing only a few small paper scraps. The vacuum cleaner bag was new, as if just used to clean the carpet. He clearly sensed an effort to conceal something, though no specific evidence yet. Back in the garage, he asked the technician about the blood test results. The reply was brief. Positive reaction, blood type O+, but lab confirmation needed. McKinley recorded every detail, from sample position to stain direction, then requested full photos with large format film for the file. That afternoon, all samples were transported to the lab. Preliminary reports showed the garage stain contained human blood type O+, the yard ash contained gasoline and burned synthetic fabric. A small amount of iron compound from melted metal was detected, indicating high-temperature burning, not ordinary trash fire. From this data, McKinley concluded there was likely an attempt to erase evidence on the property. When the report was sent to the office, McKinley immediately requested a warrant to interrogate David Pearson. In the application, he stated, "Discovery of substance, suspected human blood at missing person's residence. Scene shows signs of object burning with gasoline, need to interrogate subject for verification." The warrant was approved that same afternoon. Before leaving the scene, McKinley paused in the yard, looking through the ash layers scraped into thin sheets. The gasoline smell still lingered in the damp soil, rising with the faint smoke of a case, gradually moving beyond the boundary of an ordinary missing person report. That night, upon returning to headquarters, File 0479-79 was updated with a new line in the classification section, suspicious disappearance, possible domestic violence. Victim undetermined. Translation: disappearance with signs of domestic violence, victim unidentified. From a midnight missing person call, Natalie Pearson's case had now entered the first phase of criminal investigation, with silent but undeniable traces. The next morning, upon receiving preliminary analysis results, Detective John McKinley issued a summons for David Pearson to the Seattle Police Department. The interrogation took place in Room 3, a small space with one-way glass, dim white lighting, and a recording device on the table. David entered, looking tired, carrying a thick coat and a cold cup of coffee. He was informed that the session was to clarify certain points in the investigation regarding his wife's disappearance. McKinley sat across from him, voice low and patient as always. He began with simple questions. David's schedule over the past 2 days, who he met, and why he had not proactively joined the search. David answered slowly, occasionally pausing mid-sentence as if trying to recall. He said he had tried to stay calm and believed police would do better at finding her. When McKinley asked about the ash pile discovered in the backyard, David flinched slightly, then quickly regained composure. He said it was just garden waste, dry leaves, broken branches, and some old wood he gathered and burned to clean up. Regarding the garage stain, he claimed it could be machine oil or spilled paint from fixing the car a few weeks prior. McKinley silently took notes, did not argue, only occasionally re-asked about timing and how he burned the trash. When asked why he used gasoline to burn it, David replied briefly, to make it burn faster, the weather was damp. His demeanor was nearly steady, showing neither panic nor anger, but his eyes kept looking down at the table. Mid-session, McKinley presented a copy of a receipt obtained from the Lowe's transaction system in Kirkland. The data showed that 2 days after Natalie's disappearance, David purchased a gasoline can for lawnmowers, a roll of industrial trash bags, a shovel, and a wooden-handled hammer. When asked, David explained he bought them to repair the fence and clean the backyard. McKinley made no comment, only recorded the full statement, then asked why he burned trash several days later, despite neighborhood regulations prohibiting outdoor burning. David responded in a dry voice, "I don't remember clearly, maybe I forgot." The interrogation lasted over 2 hours, during most of which McKinley simply observed how the man reacted rather than listening to the answers. Whenever Natalie was mentioned, David referred to his wife by name, not she or my wife. When asked about their recent relationship, he said normal, then fell silent for a long time before adding that every couple has arguments. McKinley did not interrupt, just looked at him for a few seconds before moving to the next question about the final evening. David insisted he was home all evening, did not go out, did not receive any calls. However, the home phone record showed a short unidentified call late at night. When McKinley mentioned it, David only replied, "Maybe a wrong number." At the end of the session, McKinley thanked him for cooperating, then left the room with a thick notepad. In the hallway outside, he met the forensics lieutenant, who had just brought additional blood test results. The garage sample was confirmed as human blood type O+, but ownership could not yet be determined. Without a comparison DNA sample and without a body, the result remained at the level of suspicion related to criminal activity. McKinley wrote a summary report that same night. He concluded that although there was no direct evidence to charge David Pearson, the chain of his behaviors, from passive attitude, the presence of unusual traces in the house, to purchasing sensitive items after his wife's disappearance, all suggested concealment. However, under legal regulations, there was no basis to detain him. Therefore, McKinley recommended continuing covert surveillance for the next 72 hours, while requesting extraction of David's bank credit and phone data to cross-reference with the incident timeline. As he temporarily closed the file, the office clock was nearing midnight. The final line of the report was typed on the typewriter, letters steady like a suppressed heartbeat. Signs of concealing criminal activity, but no physical evidence. Recommend continued monitoring of subject and expanded collection of comparison samples. Outside the window, fog still obscured the lake surface where the silver Plymouth had been found, silent like the answers McKinley had just heard. 3 days after the interrogation, while temporary surveillance was still ongoing, McKinley shifted the investigation to verifying David Pearson's alibi. He began by contacting the Boeing Field HR department, where David worked as a mechanical engineer. According to the statement in the record, David said the night Natalie disappeared he was home all evening, having worked normally until late afternoon. However, the factory's electronic time clock records showed otherwise. He left the production area nearly 2 hours early, swiping out at the gate in the late afternoon. When McKinley followed up by phone, David said he felt a bit unwell, so went home early, but there was no record of requesting leave. To the investigator, this detail further reinforced suspicion that the husband had hidden an unclear period in his schedule. McKinley ordered the assistant team to review all security camera footage from the Boeing Field area, parking lots, and nearby roads. Since the storage system at the time was still manual, only a few segments were retained. In one old, blurry, noisy tape, a silver sedan could be seen leaving the parking lot at exactly the time David swiped out. Though the license plate was unreadable, the car model matched Natalie's Plymouth. The internal report noted, "Driver unidentified but high probability Pearson vehicle." McKinley logged this detail as indirect evidence, though he understood it still lacked the weight to charge. Meanwhile, another team of investigators re-interviewed neighbors around the Lakeside house. A man living 2 houses away, Henry Laird, said that on the night Natalie disappeared, late in the evening, he heard a loud metallic impact from the direction of the Pearson house, followed by the sound of something metal falling onto a hard surface. When he stepped onto the porch to look, he saw only darkness and dim streetlight. It was raining, wind blowing hard, so he thought it might be yard items blown over. His statement coincided with the time Natalie was believed to have left work, forming a notable chain of events. However, no one else in the neighborhood saw any other unusual activity that night. No strangers, no vehicles coming or going, no unusual lights. McKinley noted the details in the file: metallic impact at suspect residence, timing matches victim's loss of contact. No direct witnesses to criminal act. To him, this was fragmentary evidence, enough to guide the investigation, but not usable as grounds for prosecution. He knew the limits of the law. Without witnesses or direct physical evidence, all speculation was meaningless in court. While awaiting additional forensic results, McKinley and the King County prosecutor held a brief meeting. They presented the full case progression, from the abandoned car, blood in the garage, ash pile in the yard, to the new alibi findings. After review, the prosecutor concluded that current evidence was only circumstantial, no body, no witnesses, and no direct link to criminal activity. "We cannot file charges based solely on a chain of assumptions," he said firmly. "We need a clearer link." McKinley left the meeting in silence. He understood the case was nearing its limit, enough for suspicion, but not enough for action. From years of experience, he knew such missing person cases often stalled without a victim's body. He continued surveillance on David Pearson, but after a few weeks, the man returned to normal life. Regular work, no leaving the city, no unusual contacts. File 04779 was updated with a brief line: alibi verified, work time discrepancy, witness statement on strange noise. However, lacks conclusive evidence. Continue monitoring. After nearly a month, the case remained stalled, scattered leads, not connecting into a logical chain. McKinley reread every report, trying to find any detail to exploit further, but every path led to a dead end. At the end of the report submitted in late spring 1979, he wrote briefly, "Insufficient grounds for prosecution. Continue open file monitoring." Natalie Pearson's disappearance remained dormant in the Seattle Police Department's suspicious cases list, neither closed nor advancing. And for McKinley, this was the most difficult type of case to accept. When all signs pointed to guilt, but the hand of the law could not yet reach the truth. After nearly a month of investigation with no progress, McKinley proposed expanding the physical search around the Lake Washington area, where Natalie's car was discovered. The proposal was quickly approved due to the case's severity and local media pressure. A small-scale operation was launched, coordinating between the Seattle Police Department, King County Rescue Forces, and volunteer dive teams. Objective: sweep the entire eastern Kirkland Lakeshore and the small forested area adjacent to Highway 520, where many trails led down to the water. The first morning of the operation, fog remained thick. The lake surface flat like a gray mirror. Small boats cut through the water, carrying dive teams with oxygen tanks and metal detectors. From the air, police helicopters circled at low altitude, scanning for unusual light reflections or floating objects. Along the western shore, dozens of officers with search dogs combed overgrown grass areas and roadside trash. McKinley stood at the temporary command post, monitoring the map covered in marking pins. He knew the chances of finding the victim after so many days were slim, but he also understood that stopping would let the case slowly sink into cold files. On the second day, the dive team discovered a piece of silver-gray fabric caught on a submerged tree root about over 100 meters from the car's location. The fabric was collected and sent for analysis, but results showed it was only industrial tarp, unrelated to Natalie's clothing. At the lake bottom, they found old items, paint cans, electrical wire, iron scraps, nothing indicating criminal activity. McKinley persisted, requesting expansion of the search radius a few more miles north to the Kirkland Heights forested area, where an abandoned industrial dump site existed. There, on the 8th day, a cleanup worker reported finding a rusty hammer with a charred wooden handle lying in a pile of scrap metal. Recognizing potential relevance, the investigation team immediately cordoned off the area, photographed, and sealed the evidence. During preliminary examination, the technician noticed the hammerhead still had dried dark brown residue. On-site rapid test showed positive reaction for human blood. The evidence was transferred to the Seattle PD lab the same day. 2 days later, the preliminary analysis report reached McKinley's desk. The blood sample on the hammer was type O+, matching the blood found in the Pearson garage. However, at that time, DNA technology was not widespread, making specific comparison with the victim impossible. All conclusions remained at possible relevance. McKinley read the report in silence, knowing this detail alone was insufficient to turn the case criminal. He called the King County prosecutor, presenting the new finding, but received the familiar response: no body, no witnesses, and no proven direct link to the evidence. We still cannot prosecute. The search operation continued for nearly 2 more weeks. Over 30 officers, along with search dogs, scoured every vacant lot, lake shore segment, and drainage areas around Kirkland. They found a few small items: a pair of gloves, black plastic fragments, torn trash bags, but nothing with identifying traces. McKinley was present every day, watching divers emerge from the water, each covered in mud and exhausted. Spring rain persisted, lake levels rose, making sweeps even harder. By the 3rd week, with rising search costs and 0 results, command decided to suspend the operation. A meeting was held at headquarters, where McKinley presented the summary: no body or conclusive evidence recovered. Only valuable discovery is the rusty hammer, but direct link to victim unprovable. The final report was filed in 04779, marking the end of the active search phase. That afternoon, McKinley stood alone by the lakeshore. The sky was thick gray, water rippling lightly. He looked at yellow tape strips still caught in the trees, wondering what happened the night Natalie disappeared and why every trace led to nothing. The 3-week search officially closed, leaving only thick reports and an unanswered question: where did Natalie Pearson go, and was she still alive? In June 1979, after the Lake Washington search ended without clear results, the Natalie Pearson file was returned to the King County Forensic Laboratory for comprehensive compilation of all evidence collected during the investigation. Samples included ash and soil from the Pearson backyard, blood stain from the garage, hairs found in cement grooves and on personal items, and the rusty hammer recovered from the industrial dump. The lab was on the 3rd floor of an old building in downtown Seattle, equipped limitedly compared to modern standards. Most analyses were manual, microscopic observation, simple chemical tests, and blood type comparison. Technicians worked for weeks, meticulously recording each result. The garage stain sample tested positive for human blood via Kastle-Meyer and benzidine reactions. When cross-referenced with rare hospital blood type records, it was confirmed O+ common in the population, thus lacking individual identification value. The hammer blood from the dump was also O+, reinforcing the hypothesis of related evidence. However, no technology at the time allowed protein trace or DNA comparison to prove same source origin. The report stated clearly, blood samples possibly from same source, but unconfirmable. Hair samples were analyzed under optical microscope. Technicians noted human female hair, dark brown, structure matching Natalie's physical description. However, since DNA testing did not exist in forensic procedures then, conclusions remained descriptive. High morphological match probability, insufficient for identity confirmation. Backyard ash and soil samples contained gasoline residue, burned synthetic fibers, and heavy metal compounds, signs of non-household material burning. Some ash contained white bone fragments, but microscopic examination identified animal bone, possibly chicken or small mammal, not human. The forensic lab compiled all findings into a nearly 20-page report, including crime scene photos and test records. In the conclusion section, the lead technician wrote, "Analysis results show presence of human blood type O+, female hair, chemically sourced burned material. However, no conclusive evidence directly linking to victim Natalie Pearson. Current testing technology limits prevent DNA or molecular origin confirmation of blood and hair samples. Recommend storing evidence in dry, sealed conditions for future re-examination when technology permits." Upon receiving the report, McKinley read every line, knowing this was the outcome he had anticipated. The evidence he painstakingly gathered was enough to raise suspicion but not to become legal leverage. In an internal meeting, he presented results to the prosecutor and investigation commander. "We have blood material traces, but unidentifiable source. No body, no witnesses. Everything remains hypothetical." The meeting ended in heavy silence, no one adding anything. On the last day of the month, King County Forensic officially issued a recommendation: suspend investigation until new information or technology can verify samples. Per procedure, all evidence was sealed, coded 04779E1 to E19, stored in the Seattle Police Department basement cold vault. The Natalie Pearson file was transferred to unresolved missing, long-term monitoring, marking closure of the initial investigation phase. That afternoon, McKinley stepped out of the office, Seattle sky thick with gray clouds. He stood looking through the window at the wet street below, where people hurried as if nothing had ever happened. Inside him remained only the familiar emptiness, the feeling of an unsolved case. The forensic report on his desk stayed open to the final page, typewriter letters steady but cold. Insufficient evidence for conclusion. Recommend suspending investigation. 2 years after the investigation was suspended, Natalie Pearson's disappearance nearly faded into oblivion. In 1981, File 04779 was only mentioned during periodic reviews of unsolved cases. McKinley, now reassigned to another criminal investigation unit, maintained the habit of reviewing old files quarterly. He opened the thick, yellow document stack, containing dozens of reports, crime scene photos, test results, and pencil-scrawled notes. Despite efforts to connect the information fragments, he still found no link strong enough to change the situation. No body, no witnesses, no signs Natalie was alive. Sporadic civilian searches around Lake Washington yielded nothing. The case became one of hundreds of unsolved disappearances in the Pacific Northwest during that era. In early spring of that year, after reviewing backlog cases, the King County Prosecutor's Office issued an official notice: no new evidence or legal grounds to continue prosecution in the Natalie Pearson disappearance. The decision was signed by Chief Assistant Prosecutor Robert E. Lawrence, designating File 04779 as unsolved, suspected homicide. Per regulations, all related evidence, from blood samples, ash, hair, to the rusty hammer, was resealed in oilcloth bags, hand-labeled, and stored in the King County Evidence Vault in the First Avenue Police Headquarters basement. The sealing record noted May 12, 1981. With McKinley's final signature, he stood silently for a long time before signing the confirmation. To him, it was not just administrative procedure, but the period at the end of a nearly 2-year personal effort. In his notebook, McKinley wrote the final lines: insufficient evidence for prosecution. Primary suspect, David Pearson. Recommend keeping file open until scientific advancement or new witnesses. In the following years, McKinley maintained the habit of stopping by the storage vault whenever the opportunity arose. He told the archivist that some cases, even though filed under closed, never truly ended, they were just dusted over by time. The Natalie Pearson case was one of them. Outside, Seattle entered a period of rapid change in the 1980s. Computer industry and port economy booming, the city busier than ever. In year-end news segments, Natalie's disappearance was occasionally mentioned as a Lake Washington mystery, but it was quickly replaced by newer stories. File 04779 was placed on Shelf 4, Row C, with a paper label fading over the years. On the cover, the typed line remained clear: Natalie Pearson, missing, 1979. From then on, for many years, no one reopened that file. It lay dormant in the cold storage, alongside hundreds of other cases, like a small crack in Seattle's investigative history, where a woman vanished, a man continued living freely, and the truth seemed buried with the fog of Lake Washington. Nearly 4 decades after Natalie Pearson's disappearance was archived, the King County Police Evidence Vault changed management and moved to a new facility in South Lake Union. In 2017, when the statewide Cold Case Review Program was launched to re-examine unsolved cases from the 1960s, 1990s, hundreds of old files were pulled for review. Among them, a brown folder labeled 04779. Pearson, Natalie Pearson, missing suspected homicide, caught the attention of Detective Nora Alvarez, a veteran investigator specializing in re-examining biological evidence. Alvarez, then over 50, had worked on numerous cases resolved through modern DNA technology. She read through the 1979 investigation summary, the evenly typed lines interspersed with McKinley's handwritten notes. The final line in his notebook, "Insufficient evidence for prosecution, primary suspect, David Pearson," made Alvarez pause for a long time. She recognized the case had all the elements of a suspicious disappearance with homicide indicators, abandoned vehicle, blood traces, and questionable evidence, all potentially illuminable by modern forensic techniques. She decided to re-examine the original evidence. In the basement storage vault, old sealed boxes were numbered by year. The archivist pulled out a thick cardboard box wrapped in yellow tape, the lid still bearing the intact evidence, "Do not open" seal. Upon opening, Alvarez saw the oilcloth evidence bags, now discolored, one bag of ash, one of soil, several hair samples in glass vials, and notably the rusty hammer wrapped in old oil paper. She checked storage temperature and humidity, noting the samples were remarkably well preserved, rare for evidence over 40 years old. That same week, Alvarez drafted a request for re-examination. In the memo to command, she wrote, "Samples from file 04779 remain intact and suitable for DNA testing. Recommend transferring blood, hair, and ash samples to the Washington State Forensic Lab in Olympia for analysis using modern gene amplification technology." The request was swiftly approved under the Cold Case Project. On May 18, 2017, the evidence was resealed in specialized aluminum cases and transported by secure vehicle to the lab. Included were all original documents, crime scene photos, and McKinley's notes. For Alvarez, this was a chance to revive a forgotten case where 1979 technology had failed. After handover, she returned to the Cold Case Unit office, where younger investigators were reviewing other files. Alvarez spent the evening rereading every page of the old records, imagining McKinley in the garage decades ago, bending over the bloodstain on the cement, unable to go further. She wrote in her work log, "Pearson case, evidence in good condition, high DNA extraction potential. Need to coordinate with lab on testing sequence and sample preservation." By month's end, Seattle police officially reopened file 047-79, reclassifying the case from missing person to cold case investigation. Natalie Pearson. The case code was updated in the new database as CC 2017-214, with Nora Alvarez as lead investigator. She became the first person in nearly 40 years to touch the evidence of that disappearance. That afternoon, after signing the order, Alvarez visited the storage vault once more. She stood gazing at the hundreds of old evidence boxes lining the concrete wall, where dozens of cases had lain dormant across generations. She knew each box held an unfinished story, and the Pearson case now had a chance to be rewritten. As she left the vault, she closed her notebook, leaving only a brief line on the final page. File reopened. Objectives: identify DNA source, verify original evidence, reconstruct case timeline. From the dreary afternoon in 1979, when McKinley signed suspend investigation, to the summer of 2017, Natalie Pearson's disappearance had completed a 40-year cycle. And for the first time since then, the code 047979 was reawakened in the Seattle PD system, like an old wound reopened, to find its final answer. Nearly 3 months after the samples were sent to the Washington State Forensic Lab in Olympia, Detective Nora Alvarez received an internal notice that the DNA results for case 047979. Natalie Pearson were complete. She arrived at the lab early that morning, meeting Dr. Raymond Choi, the lead biological forensic expert. They sat in a cold white room, the table holding a thick file with charts and microscope images. The first line of the summary made Alvarez read it twice. DNA extracted from blood on hammerhead matches 99.9997%, with DNA of direct relative, victim's daughter, Emily Pearson. The report detailed the examination process. Technicians used next-generation STR gene amplification to recover DNA sequences from blood hardened for nearly 40 years. The comparison sample was provided by Emily Pearson, born 1978, the only child of Natalie and David, currently living in Spokane. Analysis showed 16 out of 16 genetic markers matched perfectly, eliminating random coincidence. The lab noted, evidence blood source is first-degree relative of sample provider, random match probability less than 1 in 10 billion. Alvarez continued to Part 2. Human skin DNA extracted from the hammer's wooden handle, preserved in oil paper. After cleaning and enzyme treatment, the team found residual epithelial cells in the wood grain, cross-referenced with public medical databases containing DNA samples from Seattle hospitals in the 1990s. Results showed 100% match with David Pearson's profile, who had donated blood in a community health program. The DNA was legally obtained via Seattle PD subpoena, and the report clearly stated, DNA on hammer handle, confirmed match with David Pearson's genetic profile, random match probability, under 1 in 10 billion. Those lines, typed in standard administrative font, carried the weight of a verdict. Alvarez sat still for quite a while, recalling the black and white photo of the rusty hammer taken in 1979. Evidence once deemed unidentified origin. 40 years had passed, and technology had brought it back as living proof. The report also stated that the experts had expanded analysis on the ash and soil samples collected from the Pearson backyard. Using spectroscopy and histological comparison, they discovered microscopic calcium phosphate and charred collagen fragments in the ash, with structures more consistent with human tissue than animal bone. Under electron microscope, the carbonized particles showed characteristics of adult human bone, burned at temperatures over 800 degrees Celsius. Additionally, degraded mitochondrial DNA traces were found, bearing genetic markers matching Emily Pearson's maternal line. The report concluded, ash sample contains burned human tissue, genetically consistent with direct relative of Natalie Pearson. As she read the final section, Alvarez clearly felt what many cold case investigators had described: absolute silence before the truth surfaced. Everything McKinley had suspected in 1979 was now proven by data. Natalie's blood on the hammerhead, David's DNA on the wooden handle, and burned human tissue in the backyard. No longer hypotheses or guesses, but a complete chain of physical evidence linking weapon, victim, and husband. In the 7-page comprehensive conclusion, Dr. Choi wrote, based on nuclear DNA, mitochondrial DNA, and histological analysis results, we determined sufficient scientific basis to conclude that 1. Blood sample on hammerhead belongs to Natalie Pearson. 2. Skin DNA sample on hammer handle belongs to David Pearson. 3. Ash and soil samples from scene contain burned human tissue, genetically consistent with victim's relative. From this data, it can be affirmed these are evidence of violent death and body concealment. Alvarez signed for the report, backed up the electronic data, and sent official information to the Seattle PD Criminal Investigation Division. That same day, she updated File 047-79 status in the system, status cold case, reclassified as homicide investigation, suspect, David Pearson. That afternoon, in the empty office, Alvarez reopened McKinley's old notebook she had read many times. The final page still held the shaky handwritten line, insufficient evidence for prosecution. She circled it in red pen, then wrote below, sufficient evidence, 2017. Outside, Seattle remained rainy as 40 years prior. But in the police files, Natalie Pearson's disappearance had finally been correctly identified, a premeditated murder, sophisticatedly concealed, now exposed by undeniable scientific evidence. After modern forensic results were confirmed, Detective Nora Alvarez began the most critical phase, fully reinvestigating the Natalie Pearson case. She reopened every old McKinley report, every crime scene photo, then worked with the cold case team to reconstruct the entire incident from a 2017 perspective. Their goal was to connect the new DNA data with the 1979 recorded events, scattered points now linkable into a logical structure. First step, the team used digital mapping and GIS software to cross-reference key locations: the Pearson family home on the Lake Washington shore, the Silver Plymouth abandonment site near Kirkland, and the backyard where ash containing burned human tissue was found. By inputting data from old photos, scene reports, and 1979 topographic maps, the team determined the 3 points formed a closed triangle just over 2 miles apart, indicating the victim likely never left the home area. Based on timelines from old statements, Alvarez reconstructed a specific time frame. Natalie left Rainlight Haven early evening, stopped at the grocery store, then drove home, and may have encountered the perpetrator in that brief window. Parallel to map reconstruction, Alvarez launched a re-interview campaign of old witnesses. She located those who lived near the Pearson home in the late 1970s, names from McKinley's reports. Henry Laird, now over 80, still clearly remembered that rainy night. When asked, he reaffirmed his original statement: metallic impact and heavy thud from the garage direction the night Natalie vanished. Another neighbor, Gloria Kemp, said she saw unusual light from the Pearson backyard later than usual that evening, but thought David was just burning trash. Those fragmented accounts from years ago, now cross-referenced with burned human tissue results, formed a reliable logical chain. Alvarez also requested the financial unit to re-examine the Lowe's purchase receipt, a detail McKinley noted but couldn't prove via handwriting. Original paper records were stored in state commercial archives and digitized in the 1990s. The scanned receipt, dated March 6, 1979, clearly listed items: gasoline, industrial trash bags, shovel, hammer, with a scrawled signature at payment. Handwriting experts compared it to David Pearson's signatures in medical records and tax documents. The examiner's conclusion: signature on receipt matches David Pearson's standard sample, random match probability below 1 in 10,000. Indirect evidence had become verified. From the gathered data, the cold case team reconstructed the likely full sequence of events. Accordingly, Natalie left Rainlight Haven early evening, stopped for groceries, then drove home. There, a conflict erupted between husband and wife, possibly over ongoing financial and personal issues. The argument turned violent. David used the hammer to attack, killing Natalie on the spot in the garage. He then dragged the body to the backyard, burned it with gasoline, and buried remains under soil and ash. To erase traces, he cleaned the entire house, disposed of trash and tools at the industrial dump, where police later found the rusty hammer. Once finished, he drove his wife's car to the Lake Washington Trail, parked it to stage a scene, then walked home via a side path. The entire act occurred overnight, before he reported her missing the next morning. The investigation team presented this timeline via 3D digital model, projecting the full sequence on a Seattle city map. Every data point, time, location, evidence, aligned with 2017 DNA results. Alvarez looked at the screen, seeing the seamless narrative of a story once abandoned. Natalie's blood on the hammer, David's DNA on the handle, human tissue in the yard, and staged abandonment by leaving the car lakeside. All connected, like the final puzzle pieces closing the picture. In the report to superiors, Alvarez wrote, based on modern forensic results, re-verified witness data, and re-examined physical evidence, the 1979 disappearance of Natalie Pearson is determined to be premeditated murder, concealed by body disposal on the property. The sole suspect with motive, opportunity, and direct genetic evidence linkage is David Pearson. When signing the final page, she knew she had completed the work McKinley had left unfinished nearly 40 years earlier. The old documents were no longer yellowed pages of the past. They had become the foundation for reconstructing the truth, and with that complete reconstruction, the Natalie Pearson case was seen for the first time in the full light of science and justice. In October 2017, after the DNA results and case reconstruction were approved, Seattle police officially requested a court warrant to excavate the backyard of 4184 Lakeview Drive, the former Pearson family home nearly 40 years prior. The house now belonged to a young couple who purchased it in the early 2000s. When Alvarez and the forensic team met them, they explained the excavation purpose in detail, and the owners immediately agreed to cooperate. A security perimeter was erected around the property, media access restricted to prevent leaks. The morning of the excavation, damp cold air enveloped the area, fog from Lake Washington drifting into the neighborhood. The forensic team marked the area using McKinley's old map, precisely where ash with gasoline and burned organic compound signs was found. They grid-marked each square meter, using ground-penetrating radar (GPR) to detect soil anomalies. Within an hour, the device recorded a strong reflection signal at nearly 1.5 meters deep, directly beneath an old pine tree in the backyard. The soil there was distinctly darker, containing fine ash particles. As the team began digging, layers of soil were carefully peeled under white lights. By mid-morning, a small ivory-colored bone fragment emerged. Alvarez stood nearby, observing through handheld binoculars, ordering a halt and full-scene photos. Minutes later, larger bone fragments appeared, forearm, pelvis, and heat-deformed skull sections. Mixed among them were dull metal objects, which after cleaning with specialized solution, revealed a plain gold wedding ring engraved inside with N&D, 1973. A technician picked it up, looked at Alvarez, and nodded slightly. The excavation lasted 2 days. In total, the forensic team recovered over 30 human bone fragments, a shattered lens piece identified as from women's eyeglasses, and numerous ash particles containing burned calcium phosphate. All were sealed and transferred to the King County Forensic Lab for identification. There, Dr. Choi, who led the hammer DNA analysis, continued overseeing. He used full genome sequencing on bone marrow samples, cross-referencing with Natalie Pearson's DNA profile, the victim's daughter. 2 weeks later, results were released. Nuclear DNA extracted from bone samples matched 100% with Natalie Pearson's direct relative. Genetic markers were identical in both mitochondrial and sex chromosome DNA, eliminating coincidence. The report concluded, based on genetic testing and anthropological characteristics, remains recovered from the backyard of 4184 Lakeview Drive are identified as Natalie Pearson, female, born 1950, missing since 1979. Upon receiving the results, Alvarez sat silently for a long time. All of McKinley's efforts 4 decades earlier, every trace thought lost, were now confirmed by irrefutable evidence. The victim never left the house. The quiet backyard, once seen merely as a trash-burning spot, was now a crime scene. Immediately after, she drafted a comprehensive report to the King County prosecutor. In the over 10-page document, she summarized the new sequence, based on DNA evidence, excavation results, and identification. Victim Natalie Pearson was murdered at her residence, body burned and buried on the property. Murder weapon, hammer recovered from industrial dump. Sole suspect, David Pearson, victim's husband. On November 22, 2017, Seattle police updated File 047 Pearson 79 status in the system, reclassified homicide. First degree, victim, Natalie Pearson. The internal bulletin issued that afternoon was concise, but carried 40 years of waiting. The disappearance that once baffled the Lake Washington area was now confirmed as first-degree murder. In the evidence vault, the polished wedding ring was placed in a black velvet box, becoming silent testimony to the final truth that Natalie Pearson never left her home. And justice, though late, had found its way back. Immediately after the case was reclassified as first-degree murder, Nora Alvarez and the cold case team's next task was locating the sole suspect, David Pearson. Old civil records showed he left Seattle in the early 1980s, shortly after his wife's disappearance investigation was suspended. From then on, David vanished from public records. Alvarez and data investigators began tracing tax records, medical files, and national voter lists. After nearly 3 weeks of searching, they found a strange match. A man named David Reynolds, born 1945 in Spokane, with identical physical description, height, and blood type as Pearson. The name first appeared in California state tax records in 1984, the year David left Washington. By cross-referencing old DMV license photos, the digital team confirmed David Reynolds and David Pearson were the same person. He now lived in Pasadena, California, in a small house in a quiet northern neighborhood, working freelance in mechanical repairs, with no criminal record. Alvarez sent the report to the FBI, requesting federal surveillance coordination. Per regulations, arresting a suspect out of state required clear legal grounds and additional DNA confirmation. FBI Los Angeles immediately opened a support file, assigning agents to coordinate with Alvarez for surveillance. For 2 weeks, they discreetly monitored David's home, recording his routine, living alone, occasional breakfast at a nearby diner, evening walks around the block. Alvarez flew to Pasadena to observe personally. Seeing the silver-haired man with a slow gait and calm expression, she felt a paradox, like watching a ghost step out of old files. But she knew his calm was merely a facade for a past concealed for nearly half a century. To ensure legal evidence, the surveillance team collected indirect DNA from household trash. One early December morning, after the garbage truck left the neighborhood, FBI agents retrieved David Reynolds' identified trash bag, sealed it, and sent it to the Los Angeles Forensic Lab. The bag contained a paper coffee cup, an old toothbrush, and used tissues. Samples were extracted for DNA and sent to the Washington State Lab for comparison with the 1979 hammer handle genetic profile. 2 weeks later, results reached Alvarez's office. DNA from the trash matched the suspect's profile on the evidence exactly, with random match probability below 1 in 100 trillion. The report stated clearly, DNA source on hammer handle matches sample from individual David Reynolds. Results confirmed via full STR technology. Random coincidence probability virtually zero. Alvarez read the results in silence. 40 years, all of McKinley's suspicions, every scattered trace, finally converged on one name. She called the King County prosecutor, reporting the findings and requesting a federal arrest warrant under interstate flight to avoid prosecution for murder. Simultaneously, she contacted the FBI Los Angeles office to prepare the coordinated plan. On January 5, 2018, the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Washington issued an official arrest warrant for David Pearson, alias David Reynolds, charged with murder in the first degree, interstate flight to avoid prosecution. The warrant was transmitted to all federal law enforcement systems, including updated identification photos and confirmed DNA data. That afternoon, Alvarez received the warrant copy, bearing the signature of federal Judge William D. Keller. She looked at the paper, where David Pearson's name, once a faded line in McKinley's old file, now appeared clear and legal, proof that truth, no matter how long buried, eventually rises from the dust of time. Seattle that afternoon had light rain. In the cold case unit office, Alvarez wrote the final line in her work log, federal arrest warrant issued. Suspect, David Pearson, residing in Pasadena, California. DNA match absolute. Preparing coordinated arrest execution. On the morning of September 10, 2018, nearly 40 years after Natalie Pearson disappeared, Pasadena police, in coordination with FBI Los Angeles and Seattle PD, executed the federal arrest warrant at the small house at 1920 Maple Avenue, where David Pearson, then 73 years old, lived under the name David Reynolds. The arrest was quiet. When agents knocked and read the warrant, he stood in the doorway, wearing an old wool coat, showing no surprise. An FBI agent later recounted that he asked only one question. They found her, didn't they? David was handcuffed, placed in a federal agent vehicle, and taken to FBI Pasadena headquarters for preliminary questioning before extradition to Washington State. In the interrogation room were Seattle PD representatives and Detective Nora Alvarez. She sat across from the man old files had labeled primary suspect for decades. His face was aged, eyes sunken, voice hoarse but clear. When Alvarez mentioned Natalie's name, He was silent for a long time, then said softly, "I thought that would never come back." At first, David denied intentionally murdering his wife, but did not dispute the conflict on the night she disappeared. He stated that they argued fiercely that day about money and separation plans. "She said she would leave and take the child with her," he said. "I lost my temper. I just wanted to stop her." According to his account, when Natalie tried to walk out the door, he grabbed the hammer used for home repairs to scare her, not to hit. In the struggle, he swung too hard and struck her head. She fell and didn't get up, he admitted. Eyes fixed on the table, hands clasped together. David continued that in panic, he dragged Natalie's body to the garage, cleaned the blood, and wrapped it in a blanket. "I didn't know what to do. I just thought if they didn't find her, no one would know," he said. He admitted using gasoline to burn the body in the backyard, then burying the ash and remains in a pit near the fence. "I couldn't stand the smoke smell," he said softly. "I just wanted to bury her and end it." Alvarez placed copies of evidence photos on the table, the rusty hammer, wedding ring, and DNA results. Upon seeing the images, David nodded. "Yes, that's the hammer. I threw it away 2 days later at the Kirkland dump." Every detail in his statement matched modern forensic reports. Natalie's blood on the hammer head, David's DNA on the handle, burned human tissue in the backyard. When asked why he left Seattle and changed his name, he replied, "I couldn't stay there. Every night I heard her calling." The interrogation record lasted nearly 4 hours, audio recorded and legally certified. In the final section, David handwritten a short statement. "I, David Pearson, admit to causing the death of my wife Natalie Pearson in early March 1979 at our home in Seattle, Washington. This act occurred during an argument, without prior intent. I take responsibility for burning and burying her in the backyard. I regret it and am ready to face the consequences." The confession was certified by the federal prosecutor representative and public defender. Alvarez sat silently as he signed, recognizing the shaky handwriting as the same signature on the 1979 Lowe's receipt. A small detail now closing the evidence circle. Immediately after the interrogation, the FBI transferred the full record, audio, and confession to the King County prosecutor. Documents were entered into the case file under new code CC 2017-214A, confirming the suspect's statement fully matched forensic data. Part of the official report stated, "Suspect confirms assault, evidence disposal and body incineration at residence." Statement aligns with DNA results, scene examination, and 2017 excavation findings. No significant contradictions between confession and legal data. As he was led to the vehicle for transfer to federal detention in Los Angeles, David turned to look at Alvarez one last time. "She didn't deserve that," she said, voice breaking. Alvarez did not respond, only nodded slightly. Inside, she felt no triumph, just the heavy quiet of a case that had completed its 40-year journey. That afternoon, local Seattle news ran a short bulletin. "Suspect in 1979, Natalie Pearson disappearance arrested in California. Police confirm confession matches investigation and DNA results." And so the case, once the greatest mystery around Lake Washington, finally had its resolution. With the husband from years ago sitting in the interrogation room, recounting his crime in a weak, hoarse voice, but denying nothing more. In June 2018, 40 years after the night Natalie Pearson vanished, the U.S. District Court for the Western District of Washington in Seattle held a public trial for the reclassified Case 04779, State of Washington versus David Pearson. Courtroom 3, on the 6th floor of the gray stone building overlooking Elliott Bay, was packed with reporters and those who had followed the case for decades. David Pearson, 73 years old, was led in wearing an old brown suit, face gaunt, hair white. He did not look around, only nodded slightly when the judge asked for identity confirmation. In the gallery, back rows held Emily Pearson, his daughter, and the DNA sample provider who broke the case. Sitting silently, eyes fixed on her aged father. King County Prosecutor Robert E. Dorsey opened with a nearly hour-long presentation, recapping the entire investigation from the rainy March 1979 night when Natalie disappeared to the 2017 excavation and modern DNA results. He presented the logical evidence chain: Natalie's blood on the hammerhead, David's DNA on the wooden handle, burned human tissue in the backyard, and the suspect's own confession. No longer a disappearance, but a murder concealed carefully for 4 decades, the prosecutor said. Voice clear, but not harsh. He pointed to the large projection screen, showing a detailed timeline: Natalie leaving Rainlight Haven, stopping at the store, returning home, and vanishing forever. The prosecutor emphasized premeditation and concealment: David purchasing gasoline, trash bags, hammer and shovel at Lowe's just before the incident, burning the body, burying ash, cleaning the scene, and staging by abandoning the car near Lake Washington. He called it a calculated sequence of actions to erase all traces of a crime. The prosecution displayed old crime scene photos, excavation evidence, and the wedding ring found with the remains. When the lights dimmed, the image of the gold ring engraved N and D, 1973, appeared, faintly gleaming amid the darkness of the past. The King County Forensic Lab was called as expert witness. Dr. Raymond Choi presented detailed DNA results to the court: blood on the hammer, fully matching Natalie's skin, DNA on the handle, matching David's, and ash soil containing burned human tissue genetically consistent with the victim. He explained the scientific process calmly, ending with random match probability is 1 in 10 billion. The jury fell silent, undeniable numbers. When defense counsel spoke, Margaret Lowe, appointed for David Pearson, did not deny the act. She admitted her client caused his wife's death, but argued it was an accident during an argument and loss of control, without intent to kill. He has lived 40 years in fear and guilt, committing no further crimes, she said gently. She asked the court to consider age, health, and David's voluntary confession and full cooperation as mitigating factors. In his final statement, David stood, speaking slowly: "I killed the woman I loved. Nothing can fix it. I don't ask for forgiveness, only to face what I deserve." The trial lasted 3 days. Old witnesses were called to reaffirm 1979 statements, including Henry Laird and Gloria Kemp. They recounted strange sounds and lights the night of the disappearance, details now perfectly aligning with David's confession. The 12-person jury heard all presentations, reviewed over 40 pieces of physical evidence. No one disputed the case was proven in every detail. The only remaining question was the degree: premeditated murder or manslaughter. The prosecutor sought first-degree murder conviction, stressing body burning, scene staging, and identity change as clear consciousness of guilt. However, defense argued no evidence showed David planned to kill his wife beforehand. Post-act actions were panic and fear. After nearly 4 hours of deliberation, the jury unanimously found David Pearson guilty of first-degree manslaughter and evidence tampering, lacking elements for premeditated murder. On June 14, 2018, Judge Harriet McConnell pronounced sentence. Considering all evidence statements and mitigating factors, the court sentences defendant David Pearson to 15 years imprisonment at a Washington State correctional facility, plus 3 years special supervised release upon completion. Defendant is credited for evidence tampering and truthful confession, but the court does not overlook the severe consequences to victim Natalie Pearson. In the moment of sentencing, David bowed his head, no reaction. Emily Pearson sat in the back row, eyes tearing. She did not leave her seat as her father was led away, only watching, hands tightly clutching her mother's wedding ring, returned by police after analysis. No one in the room spoke. That afternoon, Seattle police issued an official statement: the Natalie Pearson missing person file is confirmed fully resolved. Result: solved. 2018. The thick, heavy file, once yellowed with time, was closed once more, but this time, not with the desperate silence of 1981, but as the final period of justice served. In the cold case program summary list, the final line about the Pearson case consisted of 8 words: solved, after 39 years, homicide confirmed. And for Nora Alvarez, who had completed McKinley's journey, it was proof that sometimes the truth only slumbers, but never vanishes. In August 2018, 2 months after the sentence was pronounced, Seattle police held an internal press conference to summarize the Natalie Pearson case, once considered the city's oldest no-trace disappearance. In the fifth-floor meeting room, cold case unit investigators sat around the table, facing the thick file coded 047-79, now labeled in red, Solved, 2018. At the summary, Unit Commander Lieutenant Colonel Michael Garner stated, "The Pearson case is a prime example of the value of long-term evidence preservation and applying new forensic technology. Without the blood samples, ash and hammer stored to standard in 1979, this case would have been buried forever." He emphasized that success came not only from DNA science, but from disciplined evidence storage, something many law enforcement agencies in the old era failed to recognize as critical. Following Pearson, SPD launched the Preserve for Justice project, reviewing over 200 cold case files, identifying 37 with potential for new DNA extraction. The internal report to the Washington State Attorney General's office stated clearly, currently 37 backlog cases from 1965, 1995 awaiting genetic testing. Prioritize completion within 2 years. Seattle's cold case unit, temporarily led by Detective Nora Alvarez, was tasked with developing standardized storage and re-examination protocols. She and forensic experts established new rules. Biological evidence must be stored in controlled humidity and temperature conditions, with periodic identification checks and resealing. All digital records must be digitized for future accessibility. Additionally, SPD coordinated with the State Forensic Lab to create a cold case DNA bank, where all samples from unsolved cases would be coded and stored in the National CO DATIS database for periodic cross-referencing. Seattle media quickly covered the story. A Seattle Times article, headlined, 40 years later, Justice for Natalie Pearson redefines cold case standards. The piece wrote, "Not just a closed case, Pearson marks a turning point in new decade investigative thinking, where time is no longer a barrier, and evidence is never truly lost." Police training schools in the state used it as a case study for teaching long-term evidence preservation protocols. Many young officers, when asked, mentioned Nora Alvarez's name as a symbol of professional perseverance. She didn't just solve a case. She restored faith that justice can be late, but never extinguished. In the year-end report, SPD tallied, since restarting the cold case program, 12 cases underwent DNA re-examination, with 4 leading to suspect arrests, 3 closed as confirmed natural deaths, and the rest awaiting results. The numbers were small, but opened a major path: science bridging past and present. The summary's opening line read, "DNA technology not only detects crime but exonerates, restores memory, and perfects justice." The Pearson case also drove changes in Washington state's forensic system. The Attorney General's office approved special funding to upgrade STR and mitochondrial DNA testing equipment, expanding the federal database for faster retrieval. A new lab in Olympia was named Forensic Integrity Lab, with the motto etched on the glass door, "Evidence remembers." That phrase, in Alvarez's words, is simple but most accurate. Evidence doesn't forget, it only waits to be asked again. At the new lab's dedication ceremony, one presentation slide showed the rusty hammer, now a display item in SPD's memorial room. Below it, a small caption, E12, Hammer, 1979. Evidence that solved the Natalie Pearson case after 39 years. Preserved, protected, and justice. For investigators, Pearson was a dual lesson: science can change outcomes, but only when people are persistent enough to keep the initial fragments. When asked about the success in a TV interview, Alvarez said briefly, "McKinley did the hardest part. He kept everything, not knowing when technology would catch up. We were just the continuers." That year's end, SPD released an official 48-page summary report. The opening line read, "Case 047/79, Natalie Pearson, is a prime example of combining evidence preservation, DNA technology, and federal cooperation. The case proves there is no time limit for truth. In Washington State's cold case catalog, Pearson was noted as oldest solved homicide case through DNA evidence. The longest unsolved murder cracked by DNA in the state. A small line at the file's end, added by the investigation room clerk. Reopened 2017, solved 2018. Justice served. The evening the final report was submitted, Nora Alvarez left headquarters, stepping into a hallway with thin rain. Seattle still carried the cold gray of the day. Natalie disappeared 40 years earlier. But now, in SPD's data system, the case was closed with 2 words, solved. In her work log, Alvarez wrote the final line before turning off the lights. From McKinley to us, 40 years. One thing unchanged. Justice may be slow, but it always arrives. And sometimes, just a tiny drop of blood left behind is enough to make time answer. The Natalie Pearson case story is not only a 40-year investigation journey, but a profound reflection for today's American society, where justice, though delayed, can still be restored when people refuse to give up. From seemingly meaningless evidence, a rusty hammer, a few ash samples, or yellowed notes in old files, to modern DNA technology, the case shows the enduring value of caution, science, and perseverance in seeking truth. In a modern society chasing speed and instant results, the story reminds that some things must be preserved, respected, and revisited, because sometimes truth needs time to be heard. The Pearson case also clearly reflects technology's role and human responsibility in the U.S. legal system. If McKinley in 1979 had not persistently stored the blood and ash samples, if Nora Alvarez had not dared to reopen forgotten files, no justice would have been served. That lesson applies to any field in modern American life: work, education, social relations. Never underestimate small details. Never lose faith in truth's value. Technology helps us move faster, but human integrity and determination are what keep justice alive. In an era where fake news and short memories dominate media, the Natalie Pearson case reminds every American one honest act, one preserved piece of evidence, or one small persistent effort can be the seed of future justice. Thank you for joining us in following the closure of the Natalie Pearson case, proof that justice may be late, but it never vanishes. Please subscribe to the channel to continue exploring other cold cases with us, where the truth still waits to be awakened.